In today's video I will be making the flag of Switzerland. I think it's a fun one to make because none of the colours extend to the edges of the flag, so we'll need to be using a slightly different method this time. But first let's have a look at the specs. Contrary to most national flags, this one is a square and is broken down as being 32 units by 32 units, and the arms of the White Cross are 20 units long and 6 units wide. For my flag I will simply translate these units directly into inches, because 32 inches is already a good size I think. So I have cut out a square 32 inches by 32 inches, plus a 1 inch seam allowance all the way around. I'll draw a pattern for the White Cross because I'll need two identical pieces. So for me these will be 20 inches long and 6 inches wide. And I will add a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance on all 4 edges. And I like to write the colour of the piece plus how many to cut. And now I can trace around this pattern onto the fabric, and I will be using cotton for this flag. With a pencil I redraw my seam allowances onto this fabric so I can see them for a later stage. And these are my 2 pieces of the cross all cut out and ready for the next stage. I begin with ironing over the seam allowances on every edge, using my pencil marks as an accurate guide. Just on one piece of the cross for now. I now will measure and mark the vertical and horizontal centre lines onto the flag with chalk. I will need these lines as a guide when placing the 2 white stripes of the cross. I can now lay down my first white piece vertically, using these chalk marks to centre it. Take some time to make sure that it's neat and straight and the seam allowances are carefully folded over. And then pin it in place with as many pins as you feel you need. Often more is better. To sew it in place we will be top stitching on the edge of the white piece. And do try and get your stitching as near to the edge as possible. Once you have done that, you will then want to flip it over so the back side is up. From my stitching lines, I will now mark towards the centre 2 times my seam allowance. So for me that's 3/4 of an inch, minus a fraction. And draw these lines with a pencil. I now cut along these pencil lines to remove this red layer in the middle, being very careful not to cut the white piece below it. In the 4 corners I cut the red piece halfway to the stitching line, only halfway. So for the seam we now have the red piece which is twice as wide as the white seam below it. And all we're going to do is fold this red piece around the white seam below it and top stitch it down. This can be fiddly at times, especially in the corners, so just take your time and go slowly and try to get it as neat as you can. And this is how it looks once it's been sewn. The aim is simply to seal away all of the raw edges on both sides. Next up I will prepare the second white piece by folding over the seam allowances as before, and then placing it horizontally onto the flag using my chalk guides. And then as before it's just a case of adding lots and lots of pins to keep it in place for sewing. Just like the first white piece, I will sew this in place just by top stitching along the edges. Once that is done, you will want to flip it over again so that the back side is facing up. From the new stitching lines I mark in 2 times my seam allowance and join them with a pencil line once again. And then carefully cut along these lines to remove the top layer. And also at the corners remember to cut halfway towards the stitching line. And once again, as I did before, I will simply fold over this top layer around the one underneath it and top stitch it down. This is the final result from the front. And this is how it looks from the back. I can now move on to finish off the edges, and I always begin with the right hand edge first. I left a 1-inch seam allowance, so I just fold that over and iron it. I then fold the allowance in half to conceal the raw edges and then iron again. I put a couple of pins to hold it in place, and then I sew it down with 2 rows of top stitching. I then repeat this process for the top and bottom edge, leaving the left hand edge open for the time being. The last thing to make is the strip of fabric which houses your rope or your eyelets, and I like to use a slightly thicker cotton canvas for this. I measure out the flag's height and add 1.5 inches on either end. And for the width I'm going with 2.5 inches, but this can vary depending on your fixture. I then add 1/2 inch seam allowance on both long edges, and that's it. With the front side of the flag facing upwards, I lay this piece along the open edge, and I have ironed over one of the seam allowances for later on. I then go ahead and pin it in place. For the extra 1.5 inches either side, just fold that around to the back side and pin it in place. I can then sew them together normally and trim off the extra bulk. For the 1.5 inch flaps on either end, pull them upwards and just sew down along its open edge. Now with the flag facing downwards, I fold this strip in half and pin it in place. And this is sewn on with 2 rows of top stitching. This is the end result, and of course you're welcome to do more rows of stitching if you wish, but 2 rows is usually more than enough. For my fixtures, I'll just be going with eyelets for this one, and these are simply hammered on. I've already cut my round holes in the corners, so I just have to assemble the pieces and hammer. Thank you for watching, and hopefully it's been helpful to you, and I'll see you next time.